Okay, so I'm not going to make a big introduction because Professor Natalia Szablewska is going to tell us about her work. And you more or less can read that she's going to talk about business, human rights, and multi-species justice. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting talk for lots of us in the GSI and in the university that are thinking about rights of nature, Malcolm in Latin America. And I know lots of people are interested in these coupling between law and society. So with further ado, go ahead, Professor Szablewska, and let us know about your work.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ernest. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys, for having me. Thank you to Ralphie. I hope you're watching it once you get better, and because it really has happened thanks to her and obviously everyone else who's worked behind the scenes for it to happen. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to my background because it will really set the scene and the context for this research. And by background, social scientist and a lawyer. And I tend to avoid saying a lawyer because it immediately brings to people's minds, okay, she's going to be talking about the legal stuff, etc., etc. So actually, I'm not going to be talking about the legal stuff almost at all. But it is relevant. There are some bits of my legal background that are relevant for this research. So I'm professor in law and society at the Open University UK. And I have international experience of working in the field of business and human rights, specifically in relation to modern slavery, human trafficking. I worked for a number of years as an advisor to New Zealand government, development of that legislation. I'm also a chair of business and human rights subcommittee for Australian lawyers for human rights. So I had the advocacy in the space of business and human rights in Australia for the organization, which is one of the biggest NGOs in Australia. I'm also a member of International Law Association Committee on Business and Human Rights. So obviously this is area of my interest. But what I think is also relevant is that before I moved to human rights, and that includes law, but goes beyond legal aspects of it, my initial background was in laws of armed conflict, IHL. This is the most pragmatic area of law you will find, including whether it's international or domestic law. It cannot be more pragmatic than that. And so my engagement with human rights at the theoretical level, but also at the practical level, is very much pragmatic. So even though the title might sound a little bit, philosophical, it actually is based on the practice of human rights law. And I have also practiced human rights law, litigating before the European Court of Human Rights many years ago. So in that sense, think about what I'm going to say today, and obviously any comments, suggestions are most welcome from a practical point of view. Okay, so let me get started first as to why. Why do we need to rethink business and human rights? And I will tell you what business and human rights as a field is shortly. So now that I have your attention, and by the way, this is a recent report that's been published by University of Exeter. So economists, climate scientists, risk analysts from this university, they put their data together, and basically that's what we're facing. By 2050, it is quite possible that 40% of world's population might die. This is to do with climate change, raising temperatures, increasing poverty. And when you think about it, we have been able to accumulate more wealth, but the equality gap has been growing, significantly growing. So this is what we are facing at the moment. And so how can we deal with it? And there's no easy fix, right? So it's not that on Monday we might change the world system, economic system. That's not going to happen. But we can use some of the things that we do have that are already in place and make adjustments to make sure that there are certain changes that will follow. And something that we had a conversation about with Ernesto before officially started, my interest in law is predominantly using law as a tool of social behavior change. So when you think, and I have been involved, as I said, in litigation, I've been involved in drafting legislation. So we tend to think about law as the moment that, something has passed through the parliament, depending on the system, and then how would we then rely on it to litigate, right? And that's true. But actually, as a matter of fact, writing legislation, give or take, depending what it is, takes around 6 months. That's all. Now, getting a political consensus, and I'm now talking about democratic states, can take years, really long time. So when we're talking about law, let's say the piece of paper, right, that they can literally, you can print out, that is the easiest bit of making law. It's to find that compromise that is often the most complicated. Now, but what happens during that transition, during those conversations, during those debates, clashing interests, lobbying, because all of this happens, is that we somehow change the social behavior. We amend social norms and rules around, even before the law is passed. So a lot of my colleagues in my field in law, especially international law, they're really in favor of hard law, right? Soft law being non-legally binding and hard law, because unless we have hard law, nothing will change. I tend to differ. From my perspective, and again, based on experience, you can see that change happening even without that hard law becoming hard law, because the process by which we get together and talk about and argue, that changes how we perceive things. So this is the bit, if you like, from a legal perspective that I'm interested in addition to when I am involved in some different forms of legal litigation. Now, I did say I'm going to tell you a little bit more about business and human rights shortly. But one thing I'm going to tell you right now, if we had this presentation 10, 15 years ago, and I put business and human rights together, a lot of you would just laugh. And that is often the case within even the space of human rights. And reason being is because human rights as a legal system has been developed with one purpose traditionally, is to protect individual or groups, depending on the type of rights you have, against the interferences of the state. And businesses are not the state. They're third parties, like, or non-state actors, if you like, to use the terminology of international law. What does that mean? Are they obliged to follow human rights? Can they violate human rights, et cetera, et cetera? So all those conversations are continuously to be debated. So what we have seen in recent years is more and more acceptance, even though we don't necessarily have at international level a specific treaty on business and human rights. So technically, from a legal perspective, you can't, at the international level, non-state actors cannot be responsible for human rights violations, the same as I don't owe you human rights. You don't owe me human rights, right? So that in itself is, as I said, is already pushing the boundaries. The other aspect, in order to put it in a context, is that environment and animal welfare or animal rights are at a global level are seen as separate from the human, whether that's rights or even if you think about sustainable development goals. It's supposed to be focusing on 3 aspects of sustainability. It's the environmental, social, and economic, right? But in reality, what do we see? That they are being applied separately, independently from each other, as if they were separate, and they are not. Because the idea of sustainable development is that you need to look into those aspects at the same time. But from a practical point of view, we don't do it. And so what does multi-species perspective? It attempts to integrate the human and non-human concerns. And how do we then bring it to that business and human rights agenda? So a lot of you will be familiar with the concept of multi-species justice. And what it does, so the aspects of, and you're going to find various different approaches, different theoretical underpinnings of multi-species justice. But for me, the key aspect of it is that it challenges the human-centered focus of law and policy. And it recognizes interests of non-human actors. So suddenly within the space of business and human rights, when we talk about stakeholders, involvement of stakeholders, if we were to take on a multi-species perspective, we would have to think about non-human living beings and the wider ecosystems as stakeholders as well. Is it possible? As I said at the very beginning, it is very, very pragmatic. And I will explain that in a minute. Now, multi-species justice aligns very closely with ecological ethics, but I find it more suitable because those considerations of living beings and ecosystems is more relational. Because I think that the problem we're really facing is separating human from the rest of the environment, even the language we use. Humans, animals, environment, we are part of the environment, right? I mean, this is factual. We are not separate from the environment. But that's how we have designed in recent times, because this is not, if you historically look at human relations with nature, and in some cultures it's still prevailing, we've seen ourselves as separate from the world. And I think that is really a critical problem that we're facing today. So it is really that relational interaction of multi-species justice theory with human rights. And why I use human rights, you might ask. And so we did an experiment, legal experiment. You might be familiar with the concept of rewriting legal judgments. So we started from the hard end. So the project is the Anthropocene Judgment Project, future-proofing the common law, right? And there have been lots of this type of projects around the world where legal judgments have been rewritten from a specific perspective. So it could be a feminist lens. If you took a judgment, real judgment from any jurisdiction, and look into it from a specific perspective, would you come to the same outcome? I mean, this is in itself, it's not uncommon between different branches of law. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, my background is in laws of armed conflict, and human rights obviously applies during armed conflicts as well. But if you were to use the thresholds, the tests, the legal tests that operate in both regimes, legal regimes, you might come to different outcomes, whether someone is guilty or not guilty, right? So in law, we are used to it. So this is not necessarily something that we find unacceptable or difficult as such. And so with this project, but this project kind of went a step further, because instead of taking an existing real judgment, it required us to think about a potential possible judgment in the future, right? So it still had to be based on the existing laws, and think how you would apply that law and maybe extend it, develop it further for it to be still legally valid, if that makes sense, right? So with my colleague, Clara Mancini, she's a professor of animal-computer interaction. So she set up the first lab in the world specifically looking at the welfare ethics of animal-computer interaction, right? And so what we looked in, and she's based at STEM at the Open University. We developed a scenario, a dairy farm of the future. What it means of the future means highly computers pretty much do everything, and that's based on her work that she's done in this space. Certain things are already being tested, certain things are quite likely to be developed in the future. And we looked whether we can apply human rights law, specifically here, looking into the right to dignity, privacy, and non-exploitation or slavery to farm animals. Why human rights law? It makes kind of almost is counterintuitive because human rights law has been developed for humans, right? But as I said earlier, well, human rights law has been developed to make states responsible, whereas now at the, especially domestic level, we push those boundaries. So there's nothing in law per se that stops us from developing it further. But the reason why so my work specifically focuses on human rights. It could, because as a system, not only as a legal system, but as a system, regime, enforcement, everything else, and the philosophical underpinnings is well established. So this is not instead of some other regimes in law of nature or animal rights, etc., etc. It's complementary. Let's see if we can use what we have. Let's see how we would have to develop it, amend it, in order for it to be applicable, and so it can be used as a law for non-human animals. And so this is, if you like, the exercise we did. So if you're interested how we did it, so the first part of that is explanation of the scenario, where we're coming from, what is already in existence, what we're thinking by kind of futuristic thinking about what might develop further. And the second bit is actual judgment. One thing that I am quite, because it's, and I've had these conversations, including with lawyers, and they tend to say, oh, that's quite, easy, because usually when you're a lawyer, the facts are presented to you, right? And you work on the legal bit. Whereas here, you have full discretion to make up your facts. And you would think that, therefore, you will fit your facts, the law as it is. But actually, it's so much more difficult. I had underestimated how difficult this exercise would be. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it still had to be feasible. Right? So I had to come up with facts. I had to come up with law and meet them together, right? And see whether that can hold together. So I gave this chapter to read to a couple of judges that I know of, conservative, right? Because I wanted to test from their perspective as judges, practicing judges, would they find that there is some merit to it? And actually, to my surprise, they came back and said yes. They were surprised themselves that, because the whole title of it is like, what is this, right? And then they started reading it. It's like, I think you're onto something there. So as you can see, law, I use law because it's not only a good or one of the very important tools for social behavior change, but also it is something that can provide people with an element of certainty. And I think we need that, because otherwise what we're dealing with is everyone coming with their ideas. And for individuals, for people on the street, that becomes too convoluted. It becomes difficult to understand the direction we should be going, right? So I think law has that capacity to be able to create some understandings, common understandings. We might not completely and fully subscribe to them, but nevertheless, it creates some common understandings of what might be right and what might be wrong. And as I said, I've already emphasized it, and I'll continue emphasizing it. This is very pragmatic exercise. Okay, so why businesses? Why focusing on businesses? In addition to the fact that actually I have quite extensive practical experience in the field, so that's one reason. But the other one is also, even the changes that we currently have been experiencing, businesses are already to some extent expected to behave in a certain way in relation to humans, people, but also in relation to the environment. And I'll come back to it shortly when I'll be explaining, if you like, the foundations of regulation of corporate action. So what is the corporate impact on multi-species justice, right? So still looking at the kind of high level element of it. So whether you look into global supply chains or whether you look into labor practices, what we have been witnessing is that there is intersection of human and non-human exploitation. So that is, so I work a lot in the field of modern slavery, and now we have more and more evidence showing that industries that are high risk of modern slavery, and when I say modern slavery, just in case it needs to be explained, there's no international agreed definition of modern slavery. It's what we call in law umbrella term. And now that under that umbrella term, we have legally defined various kinds of offenses or forms of modern slavery, ranging from human trafficking to forced marriage, to organ trafficking, to debt bondage, etc., etc. Right? So this is what I mean by modern slavery. So any of those aspects. And so industries that are at high risk, of modern slavery, that tend to be also the most polluting industries. And so what we also have now witnessed is that once you find human rights violations in certain region, in certain area, you're most likely going to find environmental degradation in that area as well, and vice versa. So to me, that says one thing: you cannot separate them, right? But the way it has been dealt with from the perspective of regulating business activities is to look at those issues as separate issues. And so a lot of pressures on businesses to clean up their act from an environmental point of view now has led to situations where human rights have been violated and other way around. So even from a regulatory point of view, because of that separation, it actually does not solve the problem. It pushes problem from one side to the other. So they can't. So let me give you an example. There have been some examples of environmental protection and some land being protected in various African states. But what has happened is while businesses were doing it, they were pushing away, expelling the population, often nomadic population that would live on that land. So on one hand, they were protecting the environment. On the other hand, they were violating human rights of certain groups of people. But again, I think that goes back to the very early point, which is we cannot separate ourselves from the environment. The moment we damage the environment, we damage directly ourselves. It's not indirect, it is direct because we are part of the environment. And so from the environmental point of view, in recent years, you probably would have seen and noticed and heard of lots of conversations about corporate responsibility for climate change, biodiversity laws. There have been now an increase in strategic litigation in that space. So kind of testing the ground, what cannot be done under the existing legal systems, and then if those legal systems need to be changed, updated, amended in response to it. Okay, so let me circle back to that concept of business and human rights agenda, where it comes from. As I already mentioned at the beginning, it is still relatively controversial to put business and human rights together for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But in order to understand where it comes from, it really requires to looking back into how we have attempted to regulate business activities. I don't think we need to go into the details of why we need to regulate business activities, right? But the way that has been attempted is through various frameworks. Some of those I would think you probably are well familiar with. So corporate social responsibility as a term, it started appearing in literature back in 1930s. It was coined as a term back in 1950s by American economists. So really what was focusing on, and has been focusing on because it's still in existence, is about how businesses, in addition to making profits, they should also be involved in some, doing good amongst the wider population. That's really what it is about. So none of this being linear, right? So I don't think that social responsibility necessarily came first and then RBC and then ESG and then BHR, but they have been complementing each other and they're slightly different. Then in the 1970s, with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, we started talking about what's often termed as responsible business conduct. So that aspect of that businesses, when they act, they need to do it in a responsible way. Now we can think about what would that mean in practice, and responsible socially, responsible environmentally, responsible in some other way, right? And so the first guidelines for multinational enterprises, OECD guidelines, they were produced in 1976. They have been updated since. And if you kind of historically look into it, so that was after the global financial crisis in the 1970s, mid-70s, right? 1970s. So this is, if you like, if you look up the old guidelines, you will find what it was the maximum anyone can push businesses to adopt at that stage. It has changed since, right? The guidelines have been produced since. You will see that they even introduce human rights, etc., etc. And then environmental, social, and governance framework, ESG. This is really very much in the conversations now. Everyone is talking about ESG to the point that UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, they started a study on ESG or different understandings, definitions of ESG, and they look into how ESG has been both from a kind of theoretical level, from a theoretical perspective, but also from practical perspective, how they have been implemented by businesses. And we know there are so many different definitions, right? But basically what it does, it is what CSR has done, but it's more explicit. It's focusing on the environment, on the social aspect, and the governance, right? Or good governance. That's what we're talking about. The difference between CSR and ESG, really, I would say, is that CSR is internal policy of a company, whereas ESG is what indicates to investors whether to invest in that business. I'm not going to be spending too much time on it because I fully appreciate that many of you might be actually interested in actual regulation of businesses, but I think it's important to set the scene and provide you with a bit of background. So going back quickly in history, 1990s experienced a bit of a shift. And that shift in terms of understanding of the impact of private sector on the well-being of people, including human rights. Because 1990s is where we see an increased awareness, public awareness of that impact of businesses on human rights. And so by the end of 1990s, businesses started to accept that they have some impact. They were short of saying that are legally binding expectations on them, but they accepted that there is some impact of what they do and how they do it. I'm really speeding up this history here. And then UN started looking into that framework of engaging with businesses, which led in 2011 to UN guiding principles on business and human rights, UNGP. So this is, if you like, a Bible of business and human rights. They're not legally binding, but nevertheless, they're extremely informative and authoritative. So if you have any legislation developed at the domestic level since, it's most likely, even if you don't explicitly refer to UNGPs, at some point of those kind of developments, legal developments in that country, they would have engaged with UNGPs. And it has three pillars. One is focusing on states, which explicitly states to protect. The second pillar is focusing on businesses, which is asking them to respect. And the third one is about remedies. So remedies for victims who whose rights been impacted by actions of businesses. As I did mention in the very beginning, we have been since, I think it was 2014, negotiating UN Convention on Business and Human Rights, and we are currently in the third draft. It's probably not going nowhere at this stage, given what's happening in the US and elsewhere. So we might need to park this one. Again, you know, my colleagues in law don't particularly like me when I say it, but for me, it is, whether we pass it or not, it is almost secondary to the fact that those conversations have been taking place. And again, international law is always when, you know, get students and when they say, if you teach international law, why can't we pass the national convention? Like, well, it can take anything, 20, 30 years. I mean, we could, but often it takes really long time. Nevertheless, those conversations, they have changed. And I work with businesses, multinationals and financial institutions, banks and SMEs, small, medium enterprises in different countries in the kind of practical or more professional capacity. And more businesses are aware of those expectations. So even though they're not necessarily legally binding in many jurisdictions, they've heard about those, and often they ask, what is it? What shall we do? How shall we do it? Right? So there is some impact on the ground. There has been now emerging regulatory trends across the globe in terms of introducing mandatory human rights, and often including environmental due diligence. This is usually, you know, this is where I would give you a slide full of different legislation being passed, currently being negotiated, something I've been involved in New Zealand, something I've been involved in Australia, but I will save that for some future conversations, because it is important, but it's kind of in addition to. So a lot of that, with the exception of the EU, it is at the domestic level, right? So it means that states are at liberty to decide how they're gonna regulate business activities. And a lot of modern slavery legislation that focuses on supply chains, the reason why we move that direction is because legal barriers to enforcing illegal expectations in another jurisdiction. Because what has been happening, that this company has been behaving properly, if you like, well, in the jurisdiction where they're based. But once it comes to global supply chains, which might be based anywhere in the world, they no longer have to abide by those rules. And you cannot enforce a supplier in another jurisdiction to do certain things. But what you can do is to enforce the headquarters, the company that operates in another jurisdiction to behave in a certain way, to have certain expectations in relation to those suppliers. And so indirectly changing the models, changing how things are done elsewhere. There's been a bit of backlash with it because it's some see it as legislation from far away, or legislating from far away. But ultimately, that's from a legal perspective, that's the only way to do it. Because CSR, RBC, ESG, as helpful as they have been, they are fully self-regulation. So that's why the law kicked in, to be, you know, in addition to a carrot, a bit of a stick as well, right? And this is often what the law does. And so obviously there are at least 1,000 different codes of conduct, national guidelines, including national NAPs, the national action points, plans, sorry. So this is for business and human rights in different countries. Okay, so how do we integrate multi-species justice in business and human rights regulation? This one more. Yeah, okay. I believe you can do that because already a lot of what has been happening, for example, the EU level, is looking into that corporations, businesses to do due diligence. That includes both the environment and human rights. Now, this is something I have been advocating for a really long time. And in some countries, it's been accepted, in some others, the position of the governments, without naming us, this is being recorded, they say, oh, it's too soon. Let's focus on the human rights or let's do environment as a separate processes. Whereas I've been saying that actually having them as separate processes makes it more difficult, time consuming for businesses. And if you add those things together, that means they're less likely to do it. So streamlining and expecting them to look into both environmental or wider environmental issues and human rights at the same time within already existing processes of due diligence, which businesses have to do anyway, would make it much more straightforward exercise. As I say straightforward, I mean, obviously it is complicated because it's never been done before, right? But I think practically it is done. It is doable, and it would make things a lot easier from business perspective in terms of processes, but also from regulatory perspective. So basically expanding those corporate due diligence to include wider environmental, animal, et cetera, impacts. And again, even if because earlier we talked about SDGs, right? Sustainable Development Goals, they're looking into three different dimensions, but really the way we've dealt with SDGs, and I would claim this is why they have not been very successful, is because we dealt with them separately. So there is definitely space for making sure that we link the human and environmental justice together, because it can be done. Because I want to leave enough time for the conversation. The role of technology and AI, the reason why I'm bringing this in is because there's now lots and lots of conversation in the business and human rights field about technology and AI. Ranging from technology, AI will save us, to those who think, you know, this is going to be even worse than it is now. It's probably we're somewhere in the middle. And there is no reason why we cannot develop ethical AI frameworks incorporating multi-species justice, because all AI regulation, whether at EU level, UK, anywhere else, almost explicitly looking at impact on humans. But there's a massive impact of AI and technology development on the wider environment, which this is not taking account of at all. And end of last year and beginning of this year, UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, they had a call for input on the use of AI and the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. And myself and Clara, we made a submission. Then I was invited for the oral submission, where we focus on AI, business and human rights, but we added multi-species justice to it. Basically highlighted that if you want to make sure that the impact of AI, any technology used by businesses, does not infringe human rights, you have to take into consideration non-human aspects of the environment, right? Because otherwise, you are going to end up in a situation where that protection is going to be weak protection. The report is coming out in July this year, so we shall see whether, you know, how that's got that, whether that was at all taken into account, and, you know, what might follow from it. So just to very quickly to sum up, I mean, I'm not saying, when I say it's pragmatic and practical, I'm not saying there are not going to be any challenges, because there are going to be massive challenges in terms of introducing multi-species perspective to regulating corporate action, right? But nevertheless, those challenges can be turned into opportunities, because as it stands at the moment, there are legal and policy gaps in both protecting the human but also non-human interests, and those exacerbate inequalities and ecological harm, which is, again, it is about us as being part of that environment. Now, some of the arguments I tend to get in relation to it is that corporations will resist it. Well, my response always is, well, corporations resist any form of regulation already. So that, to me, that's kind of almost non-argument, right? And you know, from a business perspective, and I've worked with businesses, it is often about the processes. So if they develop a new process, which is time consuming, which is expensive, financially and in terms of time put into it, et cetera, you might just as well ask them to look at those risks, the human and non-human wider environmental risks at the same time. Develop as a one process as opposed to separate processes that then can align or might not align. And so from my perspective, I see multi-species justice as a framework that can bridge those human rights and ecological concerns for the reasons that I earlier mentioned. And so what would potentially that mean in practice? And this is something we included in our submission with Clara that I mentioned earlier, is we give indication and suggestions for expanding existing human rights frameworks, UNGPs, to incorporate multi-species justice and ecological risks. That is nothing necessarily revolutionary in the sense that that's what we do with legislation and policies, because that's, you know, this is what is called reforming or amending legislation. So we can do that. And obviously that, as I said, from a policy point of view, and even if you think about how this has been set up at the governmental level, you often get different departments dealing with the environmental aspect and with the human aspect. So I'm not denying, we would have to have some form of innovation in terms of how we would bridge those and how we would make it work. But again, it has been done in other aspects. So I don't think that in itself is a barrier for it to happen. And obviously for me, from a more speaking as an academic, it is really about that interdisciplinary collaboration and bringing, you know, expertise, knowledge from different disciplines together and seeing what we can learn from each other, right? Because ultimately, I think, and as I said, Clara, she's in STEM, so her approach is very from technology side of things. I bring my legal, and this is where we're having those conversations. Because often what happens in practice, but often a lot in academia as well, we tend to stick to our boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, and often we talk to, you know, preach to those converted, to use that term, right? Whereas we really should be looking into that kind of across disciplines to learn from each other and to make sure that this actually can work from a practical point of view. Right, I'm going to stop there to give us time for the conversation, because ultimately it is about having those conversations. So thank you so much. Thank you. Ernesto had to leave. There's no, is there a chair, or do you want me to chair? I'm happy to chair. So whoever rises, I can see there's, or would you like to step in and be a chair?
All right, you can keep an eye on the online questions,
Okay.
can you? Are you on the Zoom?
I think mine's logged in on my computer, so if you be able to see them, if you click on the chat on the computer there, that might be in.
Well, you're not on Zoom there.
It doesn't actually allow me, just shows me I can see people, but it doesn't show me.
That's interesting here.
Let's see what they're saying.
Okay. Oh, okay. So shall we take one from the floor first, and then I will try my best to look online.
Well, I'm Tim. Sorry, I was late, Natalia. Yeah, I'm all for the ecocentric philosophy, and I'm sorry if I missed it at the start when I was late, but I'm busy watching the growth of the rights of nature movement and kind of supportive of that, and stop ecocide, etc. Could that work constructively with your pragmatic line of attack as well? Because I presume as the bits of nature that are given rights expand, that's going to intersect where businesses are having some supply chain influences. I was trying to picture whether any of those the watersheds in New Zealand that are now given legal standing, there must be corporate activity within some of those watersheds. So you can, in those cases, you can take the rights of nature law and use it to protect nature. But and this would sort of, would I be right in thinking this line of attack is kind of synergistic with that?
Totally.
Complementary.
That is exactly
Right.
the point that I made at the very, very beginning, that these are not instead of, this is complementary to what's happening elsewhere. And the reason why I think human rights regime is so relevant is because it has been already quite well established. So we can repurpose some of these mechanisms that already exist in our understandings to push forward some of those, concerns. So in that sense, it very much builds on and complements rights of nature, animal rights, animal welfare, all those, ecological jurisprudence, everything that has been happening for quite some time. And I say, from a pragmatic point of view, bring in human rights into it because we can do it.
I quite like that. Am I allowed to, can I have a quick follow-up? Because
Sure.
I get it that if you want to kind of expand out from human rights, it's natural to go to other animals first, sentient ones. In other projects, we've been looking at, do trees have standing? So a famous book, right, about giving legal standing to trees and treescapes. Can you get there from your route of expanding out human rights? Do you go through animals and then you go to fungi and trees and eventually you'll get to bacteria, or?
It is possible, totally possible. As I said, I mean, this is law. I mean, we create the law, right? So ultimately it comes down to what we want the law to be. And in that chapter that I mentioned with Clara, we touch on it because ultimately from a legal perspective, the first thing you're going to say in legal personhood, because it's about standing, right?
Yeah,
and
standing.
Yeah. But we use the number of examples from existing case law. You mentioned New Zealand, because a legal personhood has been given to a river.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So this is not, we are not talking about some imaginary perfect world one day that we can do those things. We definitely can do those things because we've already done them. There are some jurisdictions that give legal personhood to animals. Some jurisdictions, again, those tend to be jurisdictions which do have the indigenous population. So building on those, cosmologies and the philosophies that make it happen at the domestic level. So it's really about utilizing what we have, but often rethinking how, what the boundaries are. Because ultimately, and in law, we tend to like to know the boundaries. Because ultimately, law, it's supposed to be predictable, right? So that's why I said this exercise that, it's a kind of experiment, legal experiment, rewriting or writing a judgment for the future. It is so incredibly tricky for lawyers. Because, you are taught that what the law is, it needs to be predictable because ultimately, if you apply in different cases, the outcome should be the same. What we're saying is, hold on, can we just push the boundaries of it? Can we still make it feasible? And what would need to happen for this for it to be feasible? How would we need to change? What type of law or regime we would need to change in order to get there? And this is what happens in terms of review of legislation, existing legislation. You pass legislation, you do introduce, let's say, a statutory 3-year statutory legislation, as has happened with many of the Modern Slavery Acts. We learn, okay, so this did work, that didn't work, that was a disaster. Okay, let's now amend the legislation so incorporate some of the lessons learned. This is exactly what we've been doing in every other area of law. There's no reason why we can't do it here now. Yeah, okay, let me try to. Oh, thanks, and Nicholas, I'm really pleased to be here today. Okay, so that would have been the initial introduction, right? Can you actually see that? Yes, you can see it. Can I open? Make it a little bit easier. Here you are. Okay, Timothy, yeah, and so I can see. Okay, so the world's percentage of the world's population, so you're probably wondering what that is.
Is it easier if I ask my question?
Yes, please, thank you.
Yeah, the first slide you put up, that 40% of the world's population is likely to be dead in 25 years' time. I'm just wondering, to give that a context, what percentage of the population of the world in 2000 is now dead?
Due to because that particular, by the way, so this is report Exeter University report, right? So I'm bringing it back to you guys.
My fault. I'm not sure I phrased it quite like that, but
I know,
the
but-
spirit's correct.
Yeah, I mean, roughly it is correct. It is about having your attention.
Extreme risk assessment. So blame me. In our photo.
I played with it a little bit because I thought like this is really, because often, you know, when you bring in those arguments about what we face, the immediate threat and the long-term threat. The immediate threat, humans tend to react immediately, but the long-term threat, humans are really bad with actually doing something about it. So sometimes you need to use those techniques to bring that threat with kind of more in your face, so to say. Right. So as I said, this is just to catch everyone's attention. But Timothy, yes, your point is I do not know. But in terms of modern slavery, so this is one of the aspects we have discussed today, is that currently nearly 50%, 50 million people around the world are estimated to be in some form of modern slavery. Just to put it into context, and obviously the world population has increased, right? But proportionately, this is the biggest number we've ever had in modern history. That is quite confronting, I think, as well. And so what that means is because, as I said at the very beginning, the wealth has grown. So we as a world, you know, population, you know, we know we're making more and more money as a world population, but at the same time, the inequality has grown as well. So it is about the distribution of wealth that we really have a problem with.
Yeah.
So to Timothy, I don't know that that's the answer, but I suspect those numbers are quite high as well.
I mean, what struck me about it was that it's a reason. Well, 40% of the people alive today will be dead before 2050, and that has been a big problem with setting all the targets for 2050. That there's a lot of the population who say, "Well, I won't be alive then. I don't care about it, so why should I be bothered?" And you know, it's a debate about that, about how we think about our future, and in fact. Probably, in my own experience, the older you get, the more you do think about future generations rather than the less. But I don't know. Maybe that's not true for everybody.
But, sorry, go on. Because I wanted to answer that. But
yeah, the other question, the second question was about this idea you talked about this false environmental human separation, which has been particularly in the West, and it's not a feature of a lot of Eastern philosophies. I mean, do you think it's been one of the great fundamental failures, really, in the development of Western philosophy, and that's why we've ended up with these business models and legal system which don't take account of the environment? I mean, for thousands of years, indigenous populations have been living in balance with the environment without any written rules. It was just understood as common sense. So just your comments on that as well.
There is an interesting work by, and I cannot recall the name, I do apologize for that, but basically he makes very persuasive argument about that separation of human and nature, that it came with all major religions. So anywhere where you have had major, and when I say major, so anything Christianity, Islam, etc., that really started playing off on humans are here to either protect the environment or humans are here kind of the top of the hierarchy, etc. And that really has played and has found its way to the way we perceive ourselves. So even if you think about Europe, you know, pagan religions, a lot of them across Europe, they never separated human from the nature. Right, is the Christianity, you know, and once it started become the major religion in Europe itself, that is where a lot of that connection has been lost. And so today we tend to think about indigenous populations philosophies, but actually it's nothing new. It is what it used to be for pretty much all human population until we lost it. So it is about going back where we were in some sense. And from my perspective, I find it quite reassuring because we are not talking about reinventing everything that's ever humanity has done. Because we as humans, initially, all of us had that connection with nature. We just need to find it again, right? And so in that sense, I think even the most conservative people who look into it, that potentially might have some argument or find some, strength in that argument. But if I can go very quickly on your first question, and this is something we have faced difficulty in dealing with modern slavery. When you talk about regulating domestic supply chains in any country, people are very much people say yes because it's about labor standards, etc., etc. But based even on my experience working in Australia and New Zealand, specifically on that issue, it did take a little bit of time for people to understand that it's neither right, so morally right, nor actually beneficial to them to disregard what happens to workers in global supply chains which are based elsewhere. Predominantly in Global South, but that's not exclusively so. So a lot of the conversations, debates, and arguments brought forward in those countries been pretty much about exactly what Timothy, what you said, which is how to bring it to attention of people that what happens elsewhere, it's going to affect you and your quality of life at some point. So when we're talking about climate change, and we often do that distinction between people who face climate change here and now and people who know about climate change, but almost feel like it happens elsewhere. That does not affect them. Where we know that climate change affects people in the UK, we just don't talk about it enough. That affect whether it's immediate long term, might be different, let's say, than Pacific Islands, which literally can see the sea coming closer to the doorstep. Like literally, we're talking about losing the whole land, but nevertheless, that is happening everywhere around the world to different degree. And I think this is about engaging the general population in those conversations, which obviously it's not easy, because now with technology, any idea can be put out there and can be amplified and can be said to be the mainstream idea, and it's so difficult to counteract that. So it is even more difficult, but it has been done before. So this is that is my point. So I don't want to sound like I'm idealist. I'm hoping I'm sounding more a pragmatist here.
Well, a lot of it is we've seen before in the past, with the slave trade and triangular trade and things. It's just good old-fashioned disavowal that we just put it out of our minds and
well, exactly, yeah.
And in fact, in many ways nowadays, it's less easy to do that, but it's still a major problem. I know we've run over, but I mean the third point. I just wanted to ask a very quick question about which I put in the chat about what the role of the rather secretive corporate courts are in moving forwards the BHR agenda, or do they have a role in that, and who actually writes the rules for the corporate courts? Because I most people don't understand them, or even a lot of people don't even know they exist.
So are you talking arbitration here, form of arbitration, or?
I'm talking about the corporate courts where the big multinationals, will take governments to court because they've lost the right to fossil fuel, to do tearing up some other part of the world because of fossil fuels.
So it's more from the investment point of view, yes. Okay, so there are some rules that make it prohibitive for states to stand up for rights of the citizens or the environment because the corporations might actually sue them, and that happens. Yeah. And often governments pay millions in damages to those corporations. Yes. So so this is one of the abnormality that we can see, and this is again something that can be and would have to be tackled. Because if you think around public health, so this is something that people tend to know a little more about, tobacco industry. A lot of countries which, for example, would have introduced labeling or plain labeling, or wouldn't allow for tobacco to be advertised the same way as, you know, I don't know, you advertise washing powder. They lost. They've been taken to courts by those corporations, and they lost. So obviously, that is one area that would need to be addressed. There's no doubt about that, because in a sense we are going we're gonna be making one step forward and 5 steps back if we don't deal with it. But a lot of what we have noticed in recent years to kind of overcome it is when individuals or groups or class of people take corporations to courts. So this is, if you like, different rules that would apply. Shell was taking Netherlands to court in recent times, and without going into the details of it, but basically the court of the lower instance, they found that Shell is responsible and liable to some extent to CO2 emissions. Then the Court of Appeal changed it slightly because it was to do with duty of care, and whether ultimately they could establish that duty of care for Shell as a company. Now, you might look into it as a failure, but ultimately what we're seeing is more and more what we call strategic litigation in that space, exactly for that reason. So kind of rather than simply relying on the state to do certain things, which the state might or might not want to do. You know, if you think about the United States, I doubt that the United States government at this stage would, in any shape or form, want to protect the health of the people, the environment, etc., etc. But at the same time, it does not mean that we as individuals cannot do something about it. So if we want to be really very kind of legalistic, so there are legal avenues. They are not the only avenues to deal with corporate action, but this is one of the avenues. And one other thing I really want to emphasize here, because when we tend to think about corporate behavior, businesses behaving badly, and this is a bit of a flaw, you know, there's that kind of flaw in thinking within the field of business and human rights. What we mean is corporations, big multinationals. Whereas, and this is important fact, something like 80% of businesses around the world are SMEs, small, medium enterprises. So really what we're dealing with, it's the few extremely powerful, influential multinationals, but ultimately majority of businesses are not, they do not hold that power, or don't necessarily do that type of lobbying that we expected to do. Very briefly, example from New Zealand. It's now businesses, and for quite some time, SMEs, who've been pushing the government to pass legislation to regulate business behavior. So I work with the civil society in New Zealand alongside with businesses who think this is the A, right thing to do, B, they want to be competitive. And without the legislation, they cannot see how they would be competitive. So this is about leveling playing field. And so even when we say business, private sector, this is not a homogeneous group. There are differences within that group. And what corporations might want to do and what they do does not necessarily mean that all type of businesses think exactly the same way. And this is often where we tend to, even in practice, we tend to forget about that.
Sure. Yeah, but and at the end of the day, I mean, even the huge corporations are actually made up of people.
Exactly. So it's the same as when we talk about state, right?
Yeah,
state is made up of people. So ultimately, we know that from psychology and social psychology that as individuals in a crowd, we tend to behave differently than we would have as an individual. Nevertheless, ultimately, yes, we are talking about individuals behind corporations, behind states. Very quickly, Reza's question there. Should there be laws against ecocidal behaviors, corporate policies? Well, there has been. So if you think about international criminal law, sorry, I mean, this is, I don't want to go into too much detail of it because I don't think we do have the time. But ecocide has been introduced and has been discussed extensively the last few years, and there have been some movement in that space. I just want to emphasize, so we're talking about criminal responsibility for damaging environment, right, at the international level. So those conversations have been taking place. And when you think about regulation of corporate behavior from a perspective of modern slavery legislation, human rights due diligence. There have been conversations about penalties, including individual penalties against, for example, directors or board of directors who did not do the right thing, for example, right? So those so it's not only administrative fines, we are talking now more and more about criminal prosecution of those individuals behind what we call corporate veil, right? Behind those kinds of whether they are directors, board of directors, etc., etc. Okay, I think, have I captured all the questions?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I haven't missed anything, right? Thank you. So on my end, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for this very engaging, insightful conversation. I hope we'll have further opportunities to continue those. And thank you to those of you who are there online and might be listening to the recording. So take care, enjoy your afternoon. I hope the sun is shining, because it's definitely shining in Exeter. I can tell you that. Thank you.